Lucas O'Brien glanced at his watch for the third time in 5 minutes, already regretting his decision to attend his college roommate's wedding. As one of Boston's most successful real estate developers, he rarely had time for social events these days, especially ones that required him to fly cross-country to San Francisco. Yet, here he was, dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit, nursing a glass of scotch at the bar while couples twirled on the dance floor beneath crystal chandeliers. "Another one, sir?" the bartender asked, nodding at Lucas's nearly empty glass. "Please," Lucas replied, loosening his tie slightly. At 34, he was growing weary of these events, the same conversations about his success, the same not-so-subtle introductions to single women by well-meaning friends. It wasn't that he was opposed to finding someone. He simply hadn't met a woman who understood his drive, who saw beyond his bank account to the man who had built his empire from scratch. The wedding reception was in full swing at the elegant St. Regis Hotel ballroom. His friend Mark and his new bride Emily were making their rounds, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Lucas had already offered his, along with a generous check and promises to have dinner when they returned from their honeymoon in Bali. As the bartender placed a fresh drink before him, movement near the entrance caught Lucas's eye. A woman slipped into the ballroom, adjusting a dark blue dress that complemented her slender frame. Her arrival was unobtrusive, almost as if she were trying not to be noticed. Yet Lucas found it impossible to look away. She moved with quiet confidence, stopping briefly to survey the room before finding an empty table near the window. She sat alone, placed her small clutch on the table, and began to fiddle with the place card in front of her. There was something refreshingly authentic about her. In a room full of people putting on their best faces, she seemed content in her solitude, unbothered by the fact that she sat alone while everyone else mingled and danced. Lucas wasn't sure what compelled him to approach her. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was simply that she was the only person in the room who didn't appear to be having a forced good time. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, gesturing to the chair opposite her. She looked up, her eyes a striking hazel that caught the warm light of the room. "No," she replied with a small smile. "Though I should warn you, this appears to be the designated table for wedding strays." Lucas chuckled, appreciating her candor. "Then I'm in the right place." He extended his hand. "Oliver Zimmerman. Most people call me Lucas." "Julia Owens," she replied, her handshake firm. "Friend of the bride or groom?" "Groom. Mark and I were roommates at Stanford. You?" "Bride. Emily and I worked together at the same publishing house." Julia took a sip of her champagne. "Though I almost didn't make it. My flight from New York was delayed and I missed the ceremony." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You came all the way from New York for this?" "Emily's one of my closest friends." "I wouldn't miss her wedding," Julia said with a sincerity that Lucas found oddly touching. "Besides, I grew up here in San Francisco. It gives me a chance to visit home." There was something refreshing about her straightforward manner. No pretense, no angling to discover what he did for a living, or how much money he had, questions that typically surfaced within the first 5 minutes of meeting someone new at events like these. "So what keeps you in New York?" Lucas asked, genuinely interested. "I'm an editor at Pinnacle Publishing. I specialize in contemporary fiction." "Anything I might have read?" Julia's eyes lit up. "Have you read The Silent Harbor by Rebecca Chen, or Midnight Crossroads?" Lucas nodded. "Actually, I have. The Silent Harbor kept me company on a flight to Tokyo last month. Couldn't put it down." "That was one of mine," she said, unable to hide her pride. "It took us 2 years to get it just right, but it was worth every late night." The conversation flowed easily after that. They discovered they shared a love for obscure indie films and had both hiked the same trail in Patagonia, though 3 years apart. An hour passed before Lucas realized he hadn't checked his phone, once a rarity for a man whose business demanded constant attention. "So what about you?" Julia finally asked. "What does Oliver Zimmerman do when he's not attending weddings alone?" Lucas hesitated. This was usually where things changed. Once women discovered his net worth, they tended to look at him differently. Some became overtly interested, others tried too hard to prove they didn't care about his money. Either way, something authentic was lost. "I'm in real estate development," he said simply, deciding to keep the details vague for now. "Building homes or tearing them down?" she asked with a slight teasing tone. "A bit of both, actually. My company focuses on revitalizing urban spaces, converting old warehouses into mixed-use developments, that sort of thing." Julia nodded thoughtfully. "So you're the guy gentrifying neighborhoods and driving up rent prices?" Lucas blinked, taken aback by her directness. Most people at these events nodded politely or expressed impressed interest in his work. They didn't challenge him. "That's one way to look at it," he admitted, "though we try to include affordable housing units in all our projects, and we work with local businesses to ensure they can afford to stay." "I'm sorry," Julia said, looking genuinely contrite. "That was unfair of me. I just finished editing a book about housing inequality, and I guess it's still on my mind." "No, it's a valid concern," Lucas replied, finding her honesty refreshing. "The industry has a lot to answer for. I like to think I'm one of the good guys, but I'm sure not everyone would agree." Their conversation was interrupted as the band announced the last dance of the evening. Couples flooded the dance floor for a slow, romantic number. "Would you like to dance?" Lucas asked, surprising himself with the invitation. Julia hesitated, glancing at the crowded floor. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Lucas confessed, "but it seems a shame to come all this way and not dance at least once." She smiled then, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "All right, one dance. But don't say I didn't warn you about my two left feet." Lucas led her to the edge of the dance floor, placing one hand gently on her waist while taking her hand with the other. They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm as the singer crooned about everlasting love. "So," Julia said after a moment, "do you live in San Francisco?" "Boston, actually. I'm heading back tomorrow morning." "Ah," she said, a hint of disappointment in her voice that Lucas found oddly satisfying. "That's quite a distance from New York." "It is," he agreed, wondering why that suddenly felt like a problem when it never had before. As the song came to an end, Lucas found himself reluctant to let go. There was something about Julia Owens that intrigued him, a genuineness that stood out in a world where everything often felt calculated and performative. "Would you like to get some air?" he asked as the band began packing up their instruments. Julia checked the delicate watch on her wrist. "It's getting late and I promised to meet my parents for breakfast tomorrow." "Of course," Lucas said, trying to hide his disappointment. "It was nice meeting you, Julia." "You too, Lucas." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card. "If you're ever in New York and want recommendations for obscure indie films, give me a call." Lucas took the card, their fingers brushing briefly. "I will," he promised, and for once he actually meant it. As Julia said her goodbyes to the bride and groom, Lucas found himself watching her from across the room. He hadn't expected to make a meaningful connection at this wedding, had, in fact, been counting down the minutes until he could politely leave. Now he was contemplating changing his flight, but that would be impulsive. And Lucas Zimmerman didn't build a multi-million-dollar company by being impulsive. He had meetings scheduled, projects to oversee. Whatever spark he felt with Julia Owens would have to remain just that, a brief connection at a wedding, a pleasant memory. Or so he thought. The next morning, Lucas sat in the first-class lounge at San Francisco International Airport, scrolling through emails on his phone when a notification appeared, a text from Mark, the groom. "Thanks for coming, man. Emily says her friend Julia couldn't stop talking about you. Thought you should know. She's good people." Lucas stared at the message, a smile tugging at his lips. He reached into his wallet and pulled out Julia's business card, running his thumb over the embossed lettering. Julia Owens, Senior Editor, Pinnacle Publishing. Before he could talk himself out of it, he dialed her number. Julia answered on the third ring. "This is Julia." "Julia, it's Lucas, from the wedding." A pause, then a warm, "Lucas, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I'm sitting at the airport and I realized I didn't want to leave things as just a pleasant encounter at a wedding." "What did you have in mind?" Lucas took a deep breath. I'm in New York at least once a month for business. I'd like to see you again when I'm there next week. Another pause, longer this time. I'd like that, she finally said, and Lucas could hear the smile in her voice. Great, he said, feeling an unusual flutter of anticipation. I'll text you the details. As he boarded his flight back to Boston, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. He'd attended countless social events over the years, met hundreds of beautiful, accomplished women, and yet none had captured his interest the way Julia Owens had in just one evening. Perhaps it was her straightforwardness, or the way she'd challenged him about his work instead of being impressed by it. Or maybe it was simply that she seemed completely herself, no pretense, no agenda. Whatever it was, Lucas found himself looking forward to his upcoming New York trip with an eagerness that surprised him. For a man who meticulously planned every aspect of his life, this unexpected development was both unsettling and exhilarating. As the plane took off, carrying him away from San Francisco and the unexpected meeting that had stirred something long dormant within him, Lucas couldn't help but wonder if perhaps the most significant ventures in life were the ones you never planned for at all. The week passed in a blur of meetings, site visits, and conference calls. Lucas found himself checking his phone more often than usual, rereading the brief text exchanges he had had with Julia. Nothing profound, just confirmations about their dinner plans in New York and a recommendation for a book she thought he might enjoy. Yet each message left him with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. By Friday, as his private jet touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, Lucas had to acknowledge the obvious. He was genuinely excited to see Julia again. This realization was both invigorating and unsettling for a man who prided himself on emotional discipline. He checked into his usual suite at the Pierre, overlooking Central Park. As he unpacked his overnight bag, his phone buzzed with a message from Julia. Looking forward to dinner. Hope you don't mind, but I've made a slight change of plans. There's a place I think you'll like better than the one you suggested. Meet me at 8 instead of 7:30. The address is attached. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Few people took the liberty of changing plans he had made, especially not someone he barely knew. Yet instead of feeling annoyed, he found himself intrigued. He texted back his agreement and spent the remainder of the afternoon in a meeting with potential investors, though his mind repeatedly drifted to the evening ahead. At precisely 7:45 p.m., his driver dropped him off at the address Julia had provided. Lucas looked up, puzzled. Instead of a high-end restaurant, he stood before a modest-looking building in the East Village with a small, unassuming sign, Eliza's Kitchen. As he pushed open the door, the aroma of garlic, herbs, and freshly baked bread enveloped him. The space was cozy and intimate, with perhaps 15 tables total, most of them occupied by people engaged in animated conversations. The lighting was warm, provided by vintage chandeliers and candles on each table. Julia sat at a corner table, wearing a simple black dress that highlighted her slender frame. Her hair was down, framing her face in soft waves. When she spotted him, her face lit up with a smile that made Lucas momentarily forget his confusion about the venue. "You found it," she said as he approached. "I did, though I'll admit I was expecting somewhere a bit more—" "Pretentious?" Julia offered with a teasing smile. Lucas chuckled. "I was going to say formal. My assistant usually books at Michelin-starred restaurants." "Well, Eliza doesn't have a Michelin star, but she has something better, the best homemade pasta in New York. And she knows me well enough to always save me a table, even on a Friday night." As if on cue, an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair approached their table, wiping her hands on her apron. "Julia Bella," she exclaimed, leaning down to kiss Julia on both cheeks. "And this must be your friend. Welcome to my kitchen." "Thank you," Lucas said, extending his hand. "It smells amazing in here." "No menus tonight," Eliza declared. "I will bring you my specials. You trust me, yes?" Before Lucas could respond, Julia nodded. "Always, Eliza." As the woman bustled back to the kitchen, Lucas raised an eyebrow. "No menus?" "Trust me," Julia said with a confidence that Lucas found oddly compelling. Eliza was my mother's college roommate. She's been feeding me since I was in diapers. You won't be disappointed. And she was right. Over the next 2 hours, they feasted on hand-rolled gnocchi and brown butter sage sauce, perfectly seared scallops, and a tiramisu that Lucas had to admit rivaled any he'd had in actual Italy. The wine, a robust Barolo that Eliza insisted on pouring herself, complemented each course perfectly. But more than the food, Lucas found himself savoring the conversation. Julia told him about growing up in San Francisco with parents who were both literature professors, about her brief stint as a journalist before finding her calling in publishing, and about her small but cherished apartment in Brooklyn that she shared with an elderly cat named Fitzgerald. In turn, Lucas found himself opening up about his own journey, how he'd started with a small inheritance from his grandfather, and parlayed it into a real estate empire through a combination of bold vision and relentless work ethic. He told her about his passion for sustainable development and his ongoing battle with city councils and zoning boards. So you're not just gentrifying neighborhoods, you're trying to transform them in a responsible way, Julia said, considering him with new interest. That's the goal, Lucas acknowledged, though the reality is often messier than the vision. Balancing profit with social responsibility isn't always straightforward. But you try, she said. That counts for something. The sincerity in her voice struck him. There was no flattery, no attempt to ingratiate herself, just a genuine acknowledgement of his efforts. As the evening wound down, Lucas realized he hadn't checked his phone, once a rarity for him, especially on a Friday night when international markets were opening. Should we get the check? He asked, noticing the restaurant had emptied considerably. Julia shook her head. Eliza never lets me pay, but I insist on leaving a generous tip. She pulled out her wallet. Please, Lucas said, placing his hand gently on hers. Let me handle this. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. Lucas was acutely aware of the softness of her skin beneath his fingers. All right, Julia finally said, her voice a touch softer than before. Outside, the April night was cool but pleasant. Street lamps cast a gentle glow on the sidewalk as they stood somewhat awkwardly, neither quite ready to say goodbye. There's a small jazz club around the corner, Julia suggested. If you're not too tired? Lucas checked his watch. It was nearly 11 typically. He would be reviewing reports or making calls to his West Coast offices at this hour, not contemplating extending an already lengthy dinner. Lead the way, he said, surprising both Julia and himself. The club was dimly lit and intimate, with a small stage where a quartet played soulful, melodic jazz. They found a small table near the back, ordered drinks, and listened as the music washed over them. Do you like jazz? Julia asked during a break between songs. I do, though I rarely make time to listen to it these days, Lucas admitted. Work has a way of consuming everything else. Julia studied him over the rim of her glass. That sounds lonely. The observation, delivered without judgment or pity, caught Lucas off guard. People often envied his success, admired his drive, or criticized his workaholic tendencies. They rarely saw through to the isolation that sometimes accompanied his achievements. It can be, he acknowledged after a moment, but it's the path I chose. The company is my creation. Sometimes I feel like if I take my hand off the wheel even for a moment, everything might fall apart. Is that really true, though? Julia asked. Haven't you built a team you trust? Systems that work even when you're not watching? Lucas considered this. In theory, yes. In practice, it's hard to let go. Control issues? She teased gently. He laughed. My executive team would certainly say so. The band returned, launching into a slow, haunting melody that filled the space between them. Without overthinking it, Lucas extended his hand. Would you like to dance? Julia hesitated only briefly before taking his hand and allowing him to lead her to the small area in front of the stage where a few other couples swayed to the music. Her body felt right against his, not too close to be presumptuous, but close enough that he could detect the subtle scent of her perfume, something floral with undertones of vanilla. As they moved together, Lucas found himself more relaxed than he had been in months, maybe years. There was something about Julia that put him at ease, her directness, her lack of pretense, the way she seemed to see him clearly without being intimidated or overly impressed by his success. When the song ended, they remained on the dance floor for one more before returning to their table. The conversation flowed easily until the band played their final number and the bartender announced last call. Outside the club, the night had grown cooler. Lucas instinctively removed his jacket and draped it over Julia's shoulders. "Such a gentleman," she said with a small smile. "Thank you for tonight. It was unexpected." "In a good way, I hope?" "Definitely," she affirmed, "though I should probably get going. I have a manuscript to review tomorrow." "Let me get you a car," Lucas offered, already reaching for his phone. "No need," Julia said. "I'm quite capable of hailing a taxi. Been doing it since I was 18. Lucas recognized the gentle but firm boundary she was setting. She wasn't looking to be taken care of, at least not in that way. "Of course," he said. "But before you go, I'll be back in New York in 2 weeks. I'd like to see you again." Julia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I'd like that too," she finally said. "But next time, let's do something besides dinner. Show me what Lucas Zimmerman does for fun when he's not building empires." With that challenge hanging in the air, she hailed a passing taxi with impressive efficiency. Before getting in, she returned his jacket and, in a move that surprised him, stood on her tiptoes to place a quick, soft kiss on his cheek. "Good night, Lucas," she said. And then she was gone, the taxi merging into the late-night traffic of Manhattan. Lucas stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, his hand absently touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. He felt an unfamiliar lightness, a sense of possibility that had nothing to do with business deals or property acquisitions. As he walked back to his hotel, the city alive around him even at this late hour, Lucas realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with his company's bottom line. And that realization, simple as it was, felt monumental. The next 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness for Lucas. Between overseeing the groundbreaking on a new development in Chicago and negotiating with investors for his latest project in Boston, he found his thoughts constantly drifting to Julia. They exchanged texts daily, nothing overly romantic, but consistent. She sent him photos of a first-edition Hemingway she discovered in a small bookshop. He shared pictures of architectural details from buildings he admired. By the time he boarded his jet for New York again, Lucas had devised what he hoped would be a perfect day. He'd taken Julia's challenge to heart, determined to show her that there was more to him than board meetings and balance sheets. When she opened the door to her Brooklyn brownstone apartment on Saturday morning, Julia's eyes widened at the sight of him in jeans, a casual button-down, and most surprisingly, sneakers. "Who are you and what have you done with the man in the custom suits?" she teased, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was exactly as he'd imagined it, bookshelves lining every available wall space, comfortable but well-worn furniture, and large windows that flooded the space with natural light. A massive orange tabby cat regarded him suspiciously from its perch on a windowsill. "That must be the famous Fitzgerald," Lucas said, nodding toward the cat. "In all his 20-pound glory," Julia confirmed. "Don't take it personally if he ignores you. He's selective with his affection." "I can respect that," Lucas replied, finding himself charmed by both the apartment and its occupants. "Ready for an adventure?" Julia eyed him curiously. "That depends. What exactly does adventure mean to a millionaire developer?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. It was the first time either of them had explicitly acknowledged his wealth. "Today, it means leaving the millionaire part behind," he said after a moment. "I thought we'd start with the farmers market at Grand Army Plaza, then head to Prospect Park. I've arranged for a private rowing lesson on the lake." Julia's expression softened. "That sounds surprisingly normal." Disappointed? Lucas asked with a slight smirk. Not at all, she replied, grabbing a light jacket. Lead the way, Mr. Non-Millionaire for the day. The farmer's market was bustling with weekend shoppers. They wandered among stalls offering everything from heirloom tomatoes to artisanal cheeses, sampling as they went. Julia seemed to know several of the vendors by name, stopping to chat and introduce Lucas with a casual, "This is my friend Lucas," that both pleased and slightly disappointed him. At a bakery stall, Lucas purchased fresh croissants and coffee, and they found a spot on the grass to enjoy their impromptu breakfast. "So this is what Lucas Zimmerman does for fun?" Julia asked, licking a bit of butter from her fingers in a way that Lucas found inexplicably captivating. "Sometimes," he admitted, "though I rarely make time for it these days. What about you? What does Julia Owens do when she's not shaping the literary landscape?" "This," she said, gesturing around them, "reading in the park, exploring bookstores, occasionally dragging myself to yoga, though Fitzgerald is a better stretcher than I am." There was something refreshingly uncomplicated about her answer. No mention of exclusive clubs or luxury spas, just simple pleasures that required little more than time and presence. After finishing their breakfast, they made their way to the boathouse at Prospect Park Lake. True to his word, Lucas had arranged for a private rowing lesson. The instructor, a weathered man named Pete with forearms like small tree trunks, gave them a brief tutorial before sending them out onto the water in a traditional wooden rowboat. Lucas took the oars first, his powerful strokes propelling them smoothly across the lake. Julia trailed her fingers in the water, her face tilted up to catch the spring sunshine. "You're good at this," she observed. "Hidden talent." "I rowed crew in college," Lucas explained. "It's been years, but some things you don't forget." "Another layer of the onion that's Oliver Zimmerman," Julia mused. "What other secrets are you hiding?" The question was light, teasing, but it prompted Lucas to consider what parts of himself he had yet to share with her. They'd known each other just over 2 weeks, yet he felt more comfortable with Julia than with people he'd known for years. "Want to take a turn?" he offered, changing the subject. Julia's attempt at rowing was less graceful, but filled with determined effort that Lucas found endearing. They took turns navigating around the lake, occasionally getting caught in patches of lily pads that required strategic maneuvering. By the time they returned the boat, both were laughing and slightly damp from Julia's more enthusiastic but less controlled rowing technique. "That was wonderful," she declared as they walked back through the park, "though I think I'll be feeling it in my arms tomorrow." "The day's not over yet," Lucas said. "There's a small art exhibition I thought you might enjoy. Then dinner at my favorite pizza place in Brooklyn, assuming you're not opposed to pizza that costs less than $50 a slice." Julia stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression suddenly serious. "Lucas, can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, caught off guard by her change in demeanor. "Why are you trying so hard to downplay who you are? The farmer's market, the rowing, the promise of non-expensive pizza, it's lovely, truly. But it feels like you're deliberately avoiding anything that might hint at your actual life." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. "I suppose I am," he admitted after a moment. "Most women I've dated have been more interested in the lifestyle I can provide than in me as a person. I wanted you to see me without all of that." Julia's expression softened. "I appreciate that. But you should know I'm not intimidated by your success, Lucas. It's part of who you are. Just like my modest apartment and second-hand furniture are part of who I am. We don't need to pretend to be something we're not." Her candor was refreshing, if slightly uncomfortable. Lucas wasn't accustomed to being called out so directly. "You're right," he conceded. "Though I genuinely do enjoy these things, it's just been a while since I made time for them." "Then let's make time together," Julia suggested, her voice gentle. "But also at some point I want to see the real Lucas Zimmerman in his natural habitat, corner office, power suits and all." Lucas felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. The prospect of integrating Julia into his actual life, not just these carefully orchestrated outings, was both exciting and terrifying. "Deal," he said, extending his hand as if to seal a business agreement. Julia laughed and ignored his hand, stepping forward to press a soft, brief kiss to his lips instead. "Deal," she echoed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The kiss, though quick, left Lucas momentarily stunned. He recovered quickly, slipping his hand into hers as they continued their walk through the park. The rest of the day unfolded with a new ease, the pretense stripped away. They viewed the art exhibition, debating the merits of various pieces, and then enjoyed what Lucas had to admit was possibly the best pizza he'd had in years at a tiny, family-owned establishment in Park Slope. As evening fell, they found themselves back at Julia's apartment building. Lucas hesitated at the entrance, unsure of the protocol. They'd shared that one brief kiss in the park, but otherwise their physical interaction had been limited to occasional touches and hand-holding. "Would you like to come up?" Julia asked, saving him from his indecision. "Fitzgerald probably won't acknowledge your existence, but I make a decent cup of tea." "I'd like that," Lucas said, following her up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. Inside, Julia moved about her kitchen with practiced efficiency, filling a kettle and retrieving mugs from a cabinet. Lucas found himself watching her, struck by how at ease she seemed in her own space, how authentic. "You're staring," she observed without turning around. "You're worth staring at," he replied simply. This made her turn, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Smooth talker." "Not usually," Lucas admitted, "but you bring it out in me, apparently." The kettle whistled, breaking the moment. Julia poured hot water over tea bags and handed him a mug adorned with a quote from Virginia Woolf. They settled on her small sofa, Fitzgerald finally deigning to acknowledge Lucas by stretching out across both their laps, effectively trapping them. "I've been approved," Lucas noted with amusement, gently scratching behind the cat's ears. "Consider yourself honored. It took my last boyfriend 3 months to get this level of acceptance." The casual mention of a previous relationship shouldn't have caused the spike of jealousy Lucas felt, but it did. How long ago was that? He found himself asking before he could stop the words. Julia studied him over the rim of her mug. "Almost 2 years. He was a fellow editor who decided San Francisco offered better opportunities. Or at least, that's what he claimed. I think he just couldn't handle being with someone who sometimes outperformed him." The revelation that someone would leave Julia over professional jealousy seemed absurd to Lucas. Her success was part of what made her attractive to him. "His loss," Lucas said sincerely. "What about you?" Julia asked. "Any tragic romance in your past?" Lucas considered the question. "Nothing tragic exactly. My last serious relationship ended about 18 months ago. Carolyn was, well, she fit perfectly into my life. Successful attorney, understood my schedule, moved in the same social circles. On paper, we made sense. But after a year together, I realized we were more like business partners than lovers. We respected each other, but there was no spark, no real connection beyond the superficial. When I ended things, she seemed more annoyed about having to find a new date for charity galas than heartbroken." Julia nodded thoughtfully. "And now? What are you looking for now?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Lucas set down his mug, carefully shifting Fitzgerald so he could turn to face Julia more directly. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "I just know that when I'm with you, I feel more present, more myself than I have in a long time. And I'd like to see where that leads." Julia's expression softened. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them. "I'd like that too," she murmured before pressing her lips to his. Unlike their earlier kiss in the park, this one deepened, growing from tentative to confident. Lucas cradled her face in his hands, savoring the softness of her lips, the faint taste of tea and honey, the small sound of contentment she made as he pulled her closer. Fitzgerald, disturbed by their movement, jumped down with an indignant meow, breaking the spell. They separated slightly, both a little breathless. "I should go," Lucas said reluctantly, aware that they were moving into territory that required more consideration than a spontaneous moment on her sofa. Julia nodded, though he could see the same reluctance in her eyes. "When do you head back to Boston?" "Tomorrow evening," Lucas replied. "But I'd like to see you again before I go. Brunch, perhaps." "I'd like that," Julia said, walking him to the door. "Text me in the morning?" At the doorway, Lucas pulled her in for one more kiss, this one gentle but promising. "Good night, Julia." As he made his way back to his hotel, the city pulsing with Saturday night energy around him, Lucas felt an unfamiliar lightness. For once, his mind wasn't racing with business concerns or strategic plans. Instead, it was filled with simpler, more immediate thoughts. The softness of Julia's lips, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the feeling of her hand in his as they walked through the park. It had been just over 2 weeks since he'd met her at Mark and Emily's wedding, yet already she had worked her way past defenses he hadn't even realized he'd built. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next step could either lead to flight or to falling. As Lucas entered his hotel suite, his phone buzzed with a message from Julia. "Thank you for today, for showing me the non-millionaire side of you. Though I'm starting to think I might like all the sides," Lucas smiled, typing back. "The feeling is mutual. Sleep well." He fell asleep that night without checking his email or reviewing the next day's schedule, a small but significant departure from his usual routine, and one that felt remarkably like freedom. Brunch the next day extended into an afternoon walking the High Line, and then an early dinner before Lucas reluctantly headed to the airport. They agreed to try for a weekend together. Soon perhaps Lucas would come to New York, or Julia might visit Boston. Over the next month, they fell into a pattern. Daily texts, phone calls that often stretched late into the night, and weekend visits whenever their schedules allowed. Lucas found himself structuring his work week around these visits, delegating tasks he would normally handle personally, rescheduling meetings to accommodate flights to New York. His executive team noticed the change. "You're leaving before 7 on a Friday?" his COO, David, remarked with exaggerated shock one afternoon in May. "The Lucas Zimmerman I know would be buried in projections until midnight." "The projections will still be there on Monday," Lucas replied, surprised to find he actually meant it. During one of Julia's visits to Boston, Lucas finally showed her his natural habitat, as she had requested his corner office in the sleek downtown high-rise that housed Zimmerman Development Group. The space was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and Boston Harbor beyond. "So this is where the magic happens," Julia said, running her fingers along his massive mahogany desk. "More like where endless meetings happen," Lucas replied with a chuckle, though he felt an unexpected pride in sharing this part of his life with her. "Show me what you're working on," she requested, genuine interest in her voice. Lucas pulled up plans for his latest project, a mixed-use development in a formerly industrial area of South Boston. As he explained his vision for affordable housing units alongside market-rate condos, with green spaces and retail that would serve the community rather than displace it, he was struck by Julia's thoughtful questions and observations. "You really do care about doing this right," she noted, as he showed her the detailed community impact assessment his team had prepared. "I try," Lucas acknowledged, though it's a constant balancing act between profit margins and social responsibility. "That's the difference, though," Julia said. "Most developers don't even try to find that balance. They just go for maximum profit." Her understanding her ability to see both the businessman and the person behind the business touched Lucas deeply. She neither vilified his wealth nor was she impressed by it. She simply accepted it as part of who he was, the same way he accepted her modest lifestyle and passionate dedication to books. That evening, as they dined at his penthouse apartment overlooking the Charles River, Lucas found himself contemplating a future with Julia in it permanently. The thought no longer frightened him, as it might have just months earlier. "Penny for your thoughts?" Julia asked, noticing his momentary distraction. Lucas smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I was just thinking about how unexpectedly right this feels." "Us." Julia's expression softened. "It does, doesn't it? Though I still can't believe I'm dating a man who owns a building with his name on it." "Just the one building," Lucas corrected with mock seriousness. "I'm very restrained that way." Julia laughed, the sound warming him from the inside. "Well, I suppose if it's just the one." Later that night, as they lay tangled in the sheets of his king-sized bed, Julia's head resting on his chest, Lucas found himself saying the words that had been building within him for weeks. "I love you," he murmured into her hair, feeling both vulnerable and certain. Julia propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the dim light. For a moment, Lucas feared he had spoken too soon, crossed a line they weren't ready for. Then she smiled, a smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her entire face. "I love you too," she replied, the words simple but profound. "Even though you're ridiculously rich and occasionally workaholic and sometimes forget that normal people don't have personal chefs." Lucas laughed, pulling her close again. "And I love you even though you constantly challenge my business practices, own more books than furniture, and have effectively made me allergic to your cat." "Fitzgerald grows on you," she protested. "So does mold," Lucas retorted, earning a playful swat from Julia before she settled back against him. As she drifted off to sleep in his arms, Lucas found himself contemplating the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment. If he hadn't attended Mark's wedding, if Julia hadn't been sitting alone at that table, if he hadn't found the courage to approach her, so many small decisions and coincidences that had somehow aligned to bring them together. For a man who had built his success on careful planning and strategic thinking, there was a beautiful irony in finding his greatest happiness through pure chance. The following months brought both deepening connection and inevitable challenges as they navigated the realities of their bi-coastal relationship. Julia's work kept her firmly anchored in New York, while Lucas's empire demanded his presence in Boston. They managed with weekend visits and the occasional week-long stay, but the constant travel began to wear on them both. "I've been thinking," Lucas said one Sunday evening as they sat on Julia's small balcony, watching the sunset over the Brooklyn skyline. "What if I opened a New York office? We've been looking to expand our East Coast operations anyway." Julia set down her wine glass, studying him carefully. "Lucas, are you suggesting uprooting your entire company headquarters for me?" "Not the headquarters," he clarified, "just establishing a significant presence here. I could split my time between the offices, be here 3 or 4 days a week." "That's a major business decision," Julia pointed out. "One you should make for business reasons, not personal ones." Lucas appreciated her pragmatism, even as it frustrated him. "It's actually sound from a business perspective. New York's real estate market offers opportunities we've been wanting to explore. But yes, being closer to you is definitely part of the calculation." Julia was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I wouldn't want you to resent me if it didn't work out professionally, I mean." "I wouldn't," Lucas assured her, reaching for her hand. "Besides, I've already had my team researching potential office spaces and development opportunities here. The numbers look promising." "You've been planning this," Julia realized, a small smile playing at her lips. "Guilty as charged," Lucas admitted. "I'm a developer, remember? Planning is what I do." The New York office became a reality by September, a sleek space in a renovated building in Chelsea. Lucas maintained his primary residence in Boston, but purchased a comfortable apartment in Manhattan, close enough to Julia's Brooklyn home that they could see each other almost daily when he was in town. Their relationship deepened as they integrated more fully into each other's lives. Julia met Lucas's parents during their annual visit from Arizona, his father a retired civil engineer, his mother a former elementary school teacher, both clearly proud of their son's success but refreshingly down to earth. Lucas, in turn, was embraced by Julia's academic parents, who questioned him intensely about his business ethics, but ultimately seemed to approve of the man who had captured their daughter's heart. By December, as they approached the 1-year mark since they'd met at the wedding, Lucas knew he was ready for the next step. The ring of vintage emeralds surrounded by small diamonds had been in his safe for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came unexpectedly, on a snowy evening when Julia arrived at his New York apartment, looking exhausted after a long day of contentious editorial meetings. "Rough day?" Lucas asked, helping her out of her coat. "The roughest," Julia confirmed, kicking off her boots. "My author is insisting on keeping a subplot that clearly doesn't work. Marketing wants to change the title to something more commercial, and my assistant quit because she got offered a job at a rival publishing house." Lucas guided her to the sofa, handed her a glass of wine, and began massaging her shoulders. "I'm sorry, love. What can I do to help?" Julia leaned into his touch, her eyes closing in appreciation. "You're already doing it. Just being here, being you. It helps put everything else in perspective." Something about her words, the simple acknowledgement that his presence brought her comfort, solidified Lucas's certainty. Without overthinking it, he reached into the side table drawer where he'd stashed the ring box weeks ago, just in case the right moment presented itself. "Julia," he said softly, moving to kneel in front of her. She opened her eyes, confusion giving way to understanding as she saw the small velvet box in his hand. "Lucas, I had a whole speech planned," he admitted with a soft laugh. "Something eloquent about how you've changed my life, how you challenge me to be better, how I can't imagine my future without you in it. But seeing you come through that door tonight, knowing that being with you at the end of a hard day is all I want for the rest of my days. I'm not going to wait for some elaborate, perfect moment." He opened the box, revealing the emerald ring nestled inside. "Julia Owens, will you marry me? Not because it's the logical next step or because it makes sense on paper, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I want to build a life with you, one that balances your books and my buildings, your cat and my allergy medication, your challenging questions and my attempts at answers." Tears welled in Julia's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Oliver Zimmerman." The ring fit perfectly on her finger. Another detail Lucas had carefully planned, enlisting Emily's help to determine Julia's size without raising suspicion. "It's beautiful," Julia murmured, admiring the way the emerald caught the light. "How did you know I prefer colored stones to diamonds?" "I pay attention," Lucas replied, joining her on the sofa and pulling her close. "Also, Emily might have provided some intelligence." Julia laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Sneaky. And here I thought my bad day just got exponentially better. You've been planning this." "For weeks," Lucas admitted, "though not for tonight specifically. You just looked so beautiful, even exhausted and frustrated, and I realized I didn't want to wait another day to ask you to be my wife." They spent the evening calling their families and closest friends to share the news. Mark and Emily were particularly excited, taking full credit for the match. "Without our wedding, you two never would have met," Mark pointed out during their video call. "True," Lucas acknowledged. "I suppose I owe you a particularly generous anniversary gift this year." As they lay in bed that night, Julia curled against him, her ring occasionally catching the dim light from the city that filtered through the curtains. Lucas found himself reflecting on the strange, wonderful journey that had led them here. "A year ago, I was so focused on my next acquisition, my next project," he mused aloud. "I couldn't see past the next quarter's projections. And now?" "And now?" Julia prompted softly. "Now I'm planning a life, not just a business strategy. And it's infinitely more satisfying." Julia smiled against his chest. "Even though it means compromising sometimes, adjusting your perfect plans?" "Especially because of that," Lucas replied honestly. "You've taught me that the most meaningful things in life rarely follow a blueprint." They decided on a September wedding, small and intimate, held in the garden of Julia's parents' San Francisco home. Despite Lucas's wealth, they opted for simplicity over extravagance, focusing on creating a meaningful celebration with their closest loved ones, rather than an elaborate society event. The planning process revealed both their differences and their growing ability to navigate them together. Julia advocated for handwritten invitations and local, seasonal flowers. Lucas insisted on flying in their favorite chef from New York and providing luxury accommodations for all out-of-town guests. They compromised, learning as they went what battles were worth fighting and when to yield to the other's preferences. In the months leading up to the wedding, they also tackled the practical aspects of merging their lives. After much discussion, they decided to maintain homes in both Boston and New York. With Lucas spending more time in New York as his office, they continued to thrive. Julia negotiated a flexible arrangement with her publishing house that allowed her to work remotely part of the month from Boston. "It's not perfect," Julia acknowledged during one of their planning discussions. "But relationships aren't about perfect. They're about finding solutions that work for both people." Lucas, who had spent his career seeking optimization and maximum efficiency, found this perspective both challenging and refreshing. Julia's willingness to embrace imperfect solutions that prioritize their relationship over individual convenience was teaching him a new way to approach problems. The wedding day arrived with perfect San Francisco weather, sunny but cool, with a light breeze that carried the scent of the roses in full bloom throughout the garden. Lucas stood under an arbor draped with white flowers and greenery, watching as Julia walked toward him on her father's arm. Her dress was simple but elegant, a vintage-inspired design that highlighted her slender frame without excessive adornment. Her hair was down, just as it had been the night they met, with small white flowers woven through the soft waves. As she reached him, taking his hands in hers, Lucas felt a certainty unlike anything he had experienced before, deeper than closing a major deal, more profound than seeing a building rise from blueprints to reality. This was the foundation of everything else, he realized. This connection, this partnership, this love. They had written their own vows, another compromise, after Julia balked at traditional language about obedience, while Lucas found her initially proposed wording a bit too poetic for public consumption. "Julia," Lucas began, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. "Before you, I measured success in square footage and profit margins. I built structures designed to withstand time while failing to build a life that would fulfill me beyond the boardroom. You changed that. You challenged me to see beyond the blueprint, to value connection over acquisition, and to understand that true wealth isn't calculated on a balance sheet." He squeezed her hands gently, drawing strength from her steady gaze. "I promise to partner with you in all things, to value your voice even when it disagrees with mine, to support your dreams as fervently as my own, and to remember that our greatest achievement will always be the life we build together. I promise to love you through revisions and rewrites, through market downturns and publishing deadlines, through every chapter of our story." Julia blinked back tears, her smile radiant as she began her own vows. "Lucas, when we met, I was content in my solitude, surrounded by books and possibilities, but not expecting to find someone who would understand both my independence and my desire for connection. You surprised me, not with your success or your resources, but with your willingness to see me exactly as I am, and to let me see you beyond the wealth and power that others fixate on." She took a deep breath, her voice growing stronger. "I promise to be your partner in the truest sense, to challenge you when needed, and support you always, to help you find balance between ambition and presence, and to build with you a home defined not by its square footage, but by the love within its walls. I promise to stand beside you through construction delays and editorial crises, through achievements and setbacks, writing our story together one day at a time." The exchange of rings, Lucas's a simple platinum band, Julia's a delicate band designed to complement her engagement ring, sealed their promises. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, The small gathering of family and friends erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held in the same garden, transformed with twinkling lights and tables arranged around a small dance floor. They shared their first dance to the same jazz melody they had danced to in that small New York club on their second date, a detail Lucas had arranged as a surprise for Julia. "You remembered," she murmured against his shoulder as they swayed together. "I remember everything about us," Lucas replied, holding her close. "The important things, anyway. I might occasionally forget dinner plans or which day Fitzgerald needs his medication, but the moments that matter, those are etched in my memory." As the evening progressed, Lucas found himself in conversation with Julia's father, a respected literature professor whose intellectual rigor had initially intimidated him. "You know," Robert Owens said, sipping his scotch thoughtfully, "when Julia first told us she was dating a real estate developer worth millions, her mother and I were concerned." Lucas nodded, unsurprised. "I imagine you worried our values might be incompatible." "Precisely," Robert confirmed. "We raised Julia to value ideas over possessions, to question systems of power and privilege. Your world seemed antithetical to those values." "And now?" Lucas asked, genuinely curious. Robert smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now I see that you're building something more important than towers of glass and steel. You're building a partnership based on mutual respect and growth. That's what matters in the end." Later that night, as they retired to the luxury suite Lucas had booked at the Fairmont, a concession to comfort, after Julia insisted they didn't need a lavish honeymoon immediately, preferring instead to plan a trip for when her current major project was completed, Lucas shared this conversation with his new wife. "Your father has given us his scholarly approval," he told her as they sat on the suite's balcony overlooking the city lights. Julia laughed, leaning against him. "High praise indeed. My mother told me something similar, that she's impressed by how you listen when I challenge you, rather than becoming defensive." "I've learned it's usually worth hearing you out," Lucas admitted. "You're right more often than not." "I'm going to remind you of that during our first real argument as a married couple," Julia teased. "I look forward to it," Lucas replied sincerely. "Even our disagreements push us forward, make us better." As they sat together, overlooking the city where they had both begun their journeys, Julia growing up in its eclectic neighborhoods, Lucas attending university in its prestigious halls, Lucas felt a profound sense of completion. The ambitious young man who had been determined to prove himself, to build something lasting in steel and glass, had finally understood that the most enduring structures were those built between people. Their story had begun with a chance meeting at a wedding, with a millionaire noticing a woman sitting alone. But it had evolved into something neither of them could have designed or planned, for a partnership that strengthened them both, that allowed them to maintain their individual identities while creating something new and beautiful together. As Julia rested her head on his shoulder, her new ring catching the moonlight, Lucas knew with absolute certainty that of all the projects he had undertaken, all the deals he had closed, all the buildings he had raised from the ground up, this marriage, this partnership, this love would be his greatest achievement. And as they planned their future together, discussing possibilities from expanding Lucas's company into sustainable housing initiatives that aligned with Julia's social values, to starting a family when the time felt right, to creating a foundation that would support literacy and affordable housing, Lucas understood that their story was just beginning. The millionaire who had attended his friend's wedding, never expecting that the woman sitting alone would capture his heart, had found something far more valuable than any property or investment. He had found a home in the truest sense of the word, not in a place but in a person, and that, he knew, was worth more than all his millions combined.